And we shall get started. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depend on where you are living. Welcome to today's lecture. We would also like to welcome the honorable guest of today, Mr. Terry Paulus. I I hope I got it right. With an admissible lesson on how to write and submit an SPE abstract. We would also like to welcome the gentlemen from different foreign companies working in the oil sector, and we're very pleased with their presence in today's lecture and are full of knowledge and um, upcoming lectures. Thank you for your good listening, Mr. Terry. And Mr. Terry is Vice President of Technology and Engineering in Carpo Ceramics. Yusuf, please, next slide. Spent about 14 years, more than 14 years in petroleum engineering industry, spending 10 of those years as a senior petroleum engineer with ARCO in Alaska, and the remaining 4 as a petroleum consultant with ARCO in Algeria, North Africa. He's now the SPE president for 2024, the previous president of the SPE Dallas division, the leader of the ATCE technical program, and the author of more than 50 papers in considering the oil and gas industry in the Middle East and North Africa, given Regional Service Award and the Technology Achievement and Improvement Award, SPE Mid-Con region. And we would also like to draw your attention that the attendance registration for the 9th day will be sent at the end of the session. Any questions you have, feel free to ask at the chat box, and your questions will be answered at the end of the lecture, or you can use raise hand button at the end of the session. Keep your mind with us, and thank you for good listening. Mr. Terry, the microphone is yours.
Okay, very good. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. How's that? So can you see it?
Loud and clear, Mr. Terry. Loud and clear.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And more importantly, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I understand that we're far away from each other, but I will do my best to try to make this work across the miles. So what I want to talk to you today, when I was first asked to speak, I was asked to speak a little bit more on some technical writing, and I suggested this topic of how to write an SP paper abstract and get it accepted. But I also will start and give just a few pointers in the early on with technical writing and why I think it's important. Okay. So as an agenda, what I'm going to do is, like I said, I will give some introductions on technical writings, just on my thoughts on that. We'll then talk about SP papers and why they're important. I'll give you an overview of the process of how it works to submit a paper. We'll then talk about writing the abstract itself. I'll give you some tips. We'll talk a little bit about ORCID. That's a new process. I'll talk about how you submit it. We'll show you the example. And then we'll take some Q&A. And I understand from what you said, we'll take the questions at the end. I'm happy to do them throughout, but I think what you're saying is we'll wait till the end. So that works. So, if I were in a room with you and I were to ask you what is technical writing, I suspect that first I would hear many people say, well, those are formal technical papers that we might write either in school or in our workplace. Perhaps if you're a graduate student, you might say it's technical writing encompasses your master's thesis, potentially your PhD dissertations, and I think you would be correct. The other thing you might say is that maybe some internal or external reports that you write. So as you get into your jobs, you'll find that you find yourself writing reports internally that document the work that you're doing or that propose workflows. And then the last one I want to point out is email. And I think many people don't consider email as technical writing. But I think you should be careful and think of it that way in many cases, because nowadays what we do is, rather than write memos, we typically write emails. And in many cases, those emails go around to many people, and they sometimes are technical in nature. So I think you should consider all of these, not just technical papers and reports, but also email, as all-inclusive in technical writing. So then the question becomes, are technical writing skills important? And I'm going to show you some examples of my background and why I think it is, but yes, it is important. It's important in all the aspects of what we just talked about. So if it's a technical paper or your master's thesis or what have you, this is your reputation. So it's establishing your reputation. It tells others who you are and your capabilities. It also may be a potential source for recognition. Some technical papers get awards, whether they're an SPE or external, or maybe internal to your company. Of course, if you are talking about your master's or PhD, you're going to get a grade. So they're very important to you. Technical reports. Internal reports that you might write inside your company to relay experiments or projects that you've done. It's very important to be able to write those well so that others understand what you did and understand your workflow. And then lastly, we talked before, again, email does take on a technical writing component. And so for many people, when they read your email, that's you. They're reading about you, and they're getting a first impression of you and your capabilities and your technical skills. So they're important as well. So overall, technical writing is a very important skill, even though as engineers, typically we tend to want to work our math and science. And we tend to let the technical writing go. It's very important that we do it well. So let me just give you a little bit more background about myself. And I'm giving you some bits and pieces because I want you to understand a couple things. So I graduated from university and took my first job with ARCO, as was introduced earlier. And very early on some of my first evaluations from my supervisors, I was told that I had very poor speaking skills and I had very poor technical writing skills. And I was told that I needed to improve that. And like many other engineers, I felt like I wanted to do engineering so I didn't have to write and I didn't have to do all the soft skills, but they're very important. And I found that out early. So I joined the Speakers Bureau, which is a speaking group at ARCO that allowed us to go out and speak to groups in the community. I also began writing SPE papers. I wrote my first paper in 1994. Over the last 15 years, I've written over 50 papers. Some of them have been peer reviewed. Some of them have shown up in the SPE journals. I learned my skills over the course of practicing and over time. And I learned my skills because people gave me feedback and I solicited feedback from others. I also have made hundreds of presentations now. And I think that my supervisor from 1986 might be surprised at the skills I've learned over the course of time because I'm far better than I used to be. So just the last thing I want to talk about then from a technical writing standpoint, these are just a couple of recommendations I would give you as you think about how to improve your technical writing. The first thing I would suggest is that you get help. That's what I did. There are many classes out there that you can take on technical writing. You may take some at your university. Your company you go work for may have some classes you can take. SPE has technical writing classes. So get help if you need it. The second thing, though, in the way I learned is just by having other people review my work. And there were people I trusted, and there were people that I knew would give me honest feedback, and that told me that I could improve by doing certain things. The other thing I'll suggest is that I would very much make sure that you proofread and review everything that you write. Now, whether it's technical reports like we talked about, or SPE papers, or even your email, I would be very careful and review and proofread the things that you write before you send them. And then one last thing about email. If you haven't already, someday you will write an emotional email, an email that you felt like you were upset or you were excited about something, and you write in the heat of the moment. And if you do that, I would highly recommend you let it sit overnight and reread it again in the morning and make sure that you still want to send it. because many times it's very easy. It's much easier now to write emails and send them than it used to be to write memos and type them up. So nowadays we have to be very careful with that. So if we were together, I would ask you to raise hands, but I want to just think about you to think about a few questions internally to yourself. Have you ever written any technical papers? And then the next question I would be thinking about is, have you ever written or submitted an SPE abstract? And I'm assuming, since most of you are students, the answer to that is probably no. And then the question is, was it accepted? And when I give this talk to other people, even professionals, I would say most of the time about half the group I'm talking to has either written an abstract or has co-authored an abstract. And almost all of them give instances of where it was not accepted. Some typically say it has, but many times they say it hasn't. And when I ask and I poll my audience and I ask them about why they've never written an abstract if they haven't, I typically get some answers that look like this. Some people will say that they are too much work and too much time and it's just not worth it. I have other people who will tell me that they didn't do it because they didn't think it would be accepted and they've heard it's very hard to do, and so it wasn't worth their time to try to get it accepted. The third thing, and this is probably the most common one I hear, is that people don't think they have anything to write about. They don't think they have something of interest, or perhaps they say that they're not experienced enough. They're young and they haven't had enough experiences. The last is that I've had some people say they just don't see a reason to do it. They don't see a benefit. So over the course of the presentation, I'm going to talk about these, and I think I'm going to answer some of those questions. So I want to add one more thing to my introduction. And again, I appreciate the introduction I was given before, but I want to add a couple of things in here, and they're important to understand. So I have served on the ATCE Program Technical Committee for several years. I'm not on it anymore, but I served on it about 10 years. Over that time, I evaluated multiple paper abstracts. I led the group. I understand how that works. I was also the program committee chair for a couple of years. I still serve on several program committees. I'm currently on the Hydraulic Fracturing Technical Conference Committee. But also, I have submitted, while I have had over 50 publications of SPE papers, I've submitted many more abstracts than the 50. I have had many that have been accepted, of course, but I've also had just as many probably rejected. So my point here is that I hope that my background and experience can help you be better at writing the abstract and getting it accepted, because I've seen all sides of the equation, both writing and getting rejected, as well as evaluating and accepting other papers. So let's talk a little bit about why we might want to write an SPE paper. Of course, then we have to write the abstract first. But why should we write SPE papers? And I'm going to show you some examples in just a second. But first of all, it is a highly selective process. Depending on which conference that you send your paper or abstract to, it could be as low as 10 or 15% acceptance, up to maybe 50%. So it is a selective process. And if you get accepted, it's a very prestigious honor. The next thing is, it is our ability to transfer knowledge across the globe. It gives you exposure, you personally, your company, and your industry. It also allows us to preserve our work. So it goes into a one petro, and it allows us to call that work up in the future for anyone who wants to look at it. As I said before, it builds your reputation. It gives you exposure, builds your reputation, builds your employer's reputation, and builds your co-author's reputation. It creates a discussion in the community. So as you know, a lot of the things that we do and we develop are disseminated, whether they're through SPE Connect or through the conference Q&A, but it allows us to have a discussion. And as we have discussion, we get better at what we're doing. And then the last thing is, I believe it's our professional obligation. I mean, even SPE's mission says its primary purpose is to collect, disseminate, and exchange technical knowledge. And we do that through SPE papers. And I think as a professional engineer, you're obligated to help others improve. And if we help everyone improve, everyone gets better. So let me show you some examples. So I want to just show you what exposure can be like for your paper. So what I'm showing you here, these are all the papers I've written Oldest papers on the left, newest papers on the right. And this is the amount of times that those papers have been downloaded from One Petro since 2007. So in the last 15 years, how many times they've been downloaded. And of course, some of the more recent papers, not as much because they haven't been out there for as long. But look at some of these older papers. A couple of papers have been downloaded 4,000 and 6,000 times. Overall, if you add them all up, I've had over 54,000 downloads. Now that's a 30-year career, and I'm not expecting everybody to have that. But my point here is that when you write a paper, others are going to look at it and they're going to download it and they're going to learn from it, and you're going to get a good exposure to colleagues. I've had multiple times people come up to me at a conference and say, "Oh, Terry, I read your paper on X," and it's a pretty good feeling. The next thing is longevity. So now we're looking at something slightly different. It's still the same papers from left to right, but what I'm looking at is the total number of downloads in just the last 12 months. So since November of 2021, this is how many times my papers have been downloaded. And of course, the more recent papers have had a lot of downloads. That makes sense. But look at some of these papers that I wrote back in 1994, back in 2007. I've had this paper downloaded over 100 times in just the last 12 months, and it was written 15 years ago. So people will continue to look at your papers and will continue to learn from them. And the last thing is just kind of your exposure and reputation. So now we're looking at the same papers again, and the last metric we're going to look at is how many times it's been cited or referenced. So this is how many times other people have referenced your work in their paper, and in this case, it's my work. And so again, if you look back here, some of these papers have been cited over 100 times. I've had over 1,000 references that at least it's been tracked in SPE. So again, keep in mind, longevity, exposure, and reputation. Let me just talk a little bit about One Petro. For those that aren't aware, One Petro is the platform where all of the SP papers are housed. And I'm sure most of you have accessed One Petro before. But it's not just SPE. There are another 15 to 20 other societies and groups that keep their papers in there that we all have access to. There's over 250,000 papers in there, and almost half of them are SPE papers. So we are by far the largest contributor to that network. And there are over 4 million downloads each year for all papers. And SPE alone adds about 3,000 to 4,000 papers every year. So it's a very comprehensive database, and it allows, again, a lot of exposure to you and to your papers. So you recall one of the things that people said is they didn't know that they had a benefit to writing an SP paper. And I do want to talk about just in specific, some of the benefits that you get, because in the end, it's going to require time. And so there has to be a benefit. So the first benefit entity that benefits is the industry. And really our industry as a whole, the petroleum and oil and gas industry, if we write papers, it allows people to read about what we're doing. It helps us improve. And it helps us disseminate and understand best practices across the world. So the global nature of One Petro is huge. If our industry does better, our industry looks better. So we help our industry. The next entity that benefits is, quite frankly, SPE. Without technical papers, we wouldn't have conferences and meetings. Our journals would not be what they are. So writing papers helps SPE and helps your professional society that you're a member of. And of course, it also helps us promote our profession to the outside world. If SPE does well, and if we're doing well, then our industry and our profession does well. And then the third group that is helped or benefits is your company, or in this case right now, maybe your school. But the important one is your company, because a lot of people will say that their company maybe doesn't like them to write papers or doesn't push them to do that. And I think it's important to help people help their companies understand that it's very important, particularly if you're a supplier. It helps you showcase your innovations and your products. Even if you're an operator, though, and you work for an oil and gas company or NOC or IOC, your reputation of that company gets better. So people see presentations from a company, employee and they say, well, I want to work for that company, or I think a lot of that company. And of course, again, if you're a supplier, it can help you attract customers. But again, I want to just close the who benefits with you. Just keep in mind, again, in the end, you are probably one of the bigger beneficiaries. And it's important that you do see benefit because you're the one who's going to take the time to write the paper. I want to just provide a quote to you from Steve Holditch. Now, I don't know how many people know who Steve Holditch is, but he was a renowned person in our industry. He passed away several years ago. He was actually the 2002 SPE president. He ran a very successful consulting business. He was the dean of petroleum engineering at Texas A&M at the end of his career. But what he says, and he tells people, is that he is 100% certain that the rewards that he received in his career were the result of writing papers and presenting them at meetings. His consulting business was very, very successful, Holditch and Associates. It was, and he will tell people it was the best advertisement he could have had for his consulting business. So he attributes a large part of his success in the industry to writing papers. Okay, so let's start talking a little bit about the paper or the abstract writing itself. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, again, do we have what it takes to write a paper? Because that's the other thought that some people say is, well, I just don't have anything to write about. So the first question is, do you have a good topic? And a lot of people think writing an SPE paper means I have to have performed some high-level research, and now I'm documenting my research for the world to see. And while that may be the case, that's a very small part of what goes into the SPE paper database. A lot of SPE papers are case histories, they're workflows, they're examples of how people solve problems. I mean, in the end, an SPE paper presents a problem, and then you present how you solve the problem. And if you go to an SPE conference and you look at the papers that have been downloaded for me, almost always the biggest number of downloads come from papers that give real life examples of how people did their job. And I would contend that all of us have that opportunity once we start working. You have to be willing to share. Okay, again, not just do you be willing to share your knowledge, but your company, if you're working for a company, has to be willing to share that as well. The other thing you need to make sure you do have is company approval. So before you get too far into the process, you'll want to find out from your company, what does it take to publish a paper? Do they allow it? What kind of approvals do you have to have? The other thing you'll want to make sure is that you have the ability to travel to whatever conference you choose to submit the paper to. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next thing to be cognizant and be careful of is if you're going to have co-authors and they're from other companies, do they have company approval as well? And then the last thing is the time. I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't take a while to write a paper. And a lot of people will ask me, how long does it take to write a paper? And really, it's just hard to say. I would say that it takes anywhere from days to weeks. Usually for me, it's weeks because you're trying to coordinate co-authors. You're trying to write papers when you have time, write words when you have time. But again, it just depends on how easy your topic is to write and, of course, how good of a technical writer you are. So I would say papers don't take as long for me now as they used to, but they will certainly take weeks. So make sure you have the time to do that. All right, let's talk a little bit about the process of how SPE papers go from ideas all the way to a journal. So the way the SPE process works is, first of all, a program committee gets together and they define a technical scope for the conference that they're going to put on. It might be an existing conference like ATCE, so that's been done already, but in a new conference, they would establish this. But a program committee is put together. SPE will then issue what they call a call for papers or call for paper proposals. It's not really a call for papers, it's really a call for abstracts. And this is where you then begin your process of trying to get your abstract accepted. So a call goes out via email. I'll show you how you can find this online as well. But that goes out, it typically has a deadline. And then so we sit down then and we write as co-authors, we'll write an abstract and submit that. Once it's submitted, the same program committee over here will then rate they'll rate or grade every paper or abstract, excuse me, they'll grade every abstract, and then they'll go ahead and select the program from the highest rated paper or abstracts. Authors are then notified, and then those that were notified to write, they will then write their paper they'll be provided with an author kit that tells them all the details. They'll have a template in there. Authors will then submit the paper to the system online. It will be proofed by the session chairs. It'll be an iterative process to improve your paper. You then go to the conference, present the paper. Once you've presented the paper, it automatically goes into OnePetro. You then have the ability at that time to submit it to a peer review and go into a journal as well. So for today, I'm focusing primarily on this part right here. And actually what I'm really focusing on is this abstract submission process. We'll touch on the calls and we'll touch on the abstract ratings, but really we're going to talk about this. Writing the paper and submitting it, and that's another time, that's another presentation. So the first thing I want to do is I want to just talk about finding a conference. So finding a conference, there's a couple of ways you can do it. Like I said before, emails go out that talk about calls for paper, but really usually what happens is you sit down and you say, I want to write a paper. So what I would suggest you do is you go to the SPE website, and we're going to do that here. I'm going to show you an example. So if I go to the SPE website and I go up here under events, I can go ahead and it'll take me to the SPE calendar, event calendar. As you can see, there are a lot of conferences that are scheduled from now till 2023, 2024. So you can go through there and you can pick them, and each one is a hot link to the specific conference. So that's one way. You can also sort it though. So you could go ahead and say, well, I'm in the Middle East region, North Africa, so I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to look for some conferences and workshops that are in my region, because I think that's where I can travel to. I can also go and look at conferences that have calls for papers open. So these are conferences that right now today you could submit a paper to, and it's before the deadline. I want to give you an example. If I go down here to ATCE, so this is the annual conference next year. If I click on that, it will then take me to the conference, and it'll tell me things about the conference, where it's going to be at, when it is. So this is of course in San Antonio in October. And then I can go ahead and it's somewhere it will have a submit paper proposal link. And I go to that link, and that will then give me the information I need to know. So it'll tell me when when it's due, January 31st, 2023. If there are some specific topics they're looking for, or technical topics, it will list them there as well. So for example, it lists down here the submission topics. So you can see it's a wide range here. Talks about the submission process. There's an author kit, author information, samples, things like that. And then you can go to the submit your paper, and this will then take you to an online system that you can upload your abstract to, and will give you some additional details. So that's the process. Like I said before, when I'm sitting down and thinking about writing a paper, I may or may not go to the calls for paper open. Typically, I'm going to go to the events calendar, and I'm going to probably look in my region. One thing to keep in mind is that some conferences may not have the call for paper open. So for example, this conference here, the Hydraulic Fracturing Conference in 2025, it's listed, but calls for paper aren't open yet. They'll be open at some point in time. And if it's hot linked, it'll tell you when that call for paper is going to open. So that's how it works. I wanted to just give you a little idea on that. So again, when you choose your conference, you're going to want to make sure you choose one that matches your topic. So again, if you're a reservoir engineering paper, you're not going to want to try to submit that to a hydraulic fracturing conference. Also make sure it again matches where you think you can travel, and the timing for when you'll have your work ready. A lot of times people will maybe submit an abstract before they're completely finished with the work, so you want to make sure you have that. And then the other thing I want to just point out is, as far as getting papers accepted, is that some conferences are harder to get into than others. I can tell you that the annual technical conference, ATCE, the hydraulic fracturing technical conference, sometimes OTC, there's a few others that are harder to get into than others. I mean, ATCE runs about 15 to 20% acceptance rate. But some of the regional meetings, so a regional conference, is typically easier to get your abstract into. So that acceptance might go up to 40, 50, 60%. Just depends on the conference. So just keep that in mind when you're submitting. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't submit to an annual conference, but just keep that in mind when you submit. Okay, so now we know how the submittal process works. So let's talk about the main topic, and that is, how do I write an abstract, and how do I write, more importantly, how do I write an abstract that will get accepted? The one thing we have to remember is this is the entry point to getting accepted. If you can't get your abstract accepted, you won't get to write the paper. So this is the most important part of the selection process. So before you get started, now that you've chosen your conference and what have you, you need to think about a few things. First of all, take note of the submission deadline. Like we showed before, January 31st, 2023 is submission deadline for ATCE. That means you have to have everything uploaded by January 31st for your abstract. If you miss the deadline, I can promise you, you won't be accepted because it'll be closed. The next thing is to consider your co-authors. Consider whether you want co-authors on your paper. We'll talk about this in some of the tips. There are some pros and cons to having co-authors. Some of the pros are sometimes it helps you get your paper accepted, particularly if you're a service company, if you can get an operator on there. As a student, you might want to have your professor on there. Of course, it means you have to coordinate other people's schedules. Also, make sure you've thought about your timelines again. Make sure that you understand what it takes in your company and your co-author's company to get something accepted or approved. Some companies can do it in a day, and some companies take 2 and 3 weeks. So you want to build that into your timeline for writing your abstract. We'll talk about the ORCID IDs in just a second, but everyone, all your co-authors and yourself have to have an ORCID ID. And then I just want to impress upon you one more time, don't miss the deadline. Okay, the deadline is very important. No one is going to call you up and ask you if you were going to write an abstract. Okay, they don't know if you're going to write an abstract, so make sure you meet the deadline. All right, so what is an abstract? So an abstract, whether it's on a paper or in the abstract submittal process, an abstract is just really an explanation of what's going to be in the paper. If you go into One Petro, you get to read an abstract, all the abstracts of the paper. You don't get to download. I mean, you don't get to read everything, but you get to see the abstract. And by reading the abstract, it tells you whether or not you want to pay to download that paper. In the course of getting an abstract accepted for SPE conference, it's also, though, your communication with the program committee on why they should accept your paper, why they should let you write a paper. Okay, so it is a sales pitch. So everything you should think about in that abstract should be about trying to convince the reviewers to give you a high rating, which then will lead to acceptance. I like to tell people to think of it like you think of your CV or your resume. Okay, one thing I can tell you is that no one is going to contact you and say, what did you mean by this? Or what, can you clarify your abstract, what have you? They will not contact you. They will just assume, and they will try to figure out. So make sure you proofread it, make sure you get input from others, have others read it, but be very careful and write very clearly. And then the last thing is it really should contain some key terms in it, and not just for indexing your work, but also just, again, you know what all the hot topics are of the day. And if the thing you're writing about has anything to do with any of the hot topics, you want to make sure you mention those topics in the abstract, because that will help you, lead you to getting accepted by the program. Okay. All right, so let's take the abstract and kind of break it apart. There are several components to a good abstract, and the first one is a good title. Okay, the next thing is very clear and concise. Okay, you want to give everybody what your methodology is, what your conclusions are. You have a word count limit, but you don't have to use it all. Okay, so just make sure you're clear and concise. You get to the point and you explain to the reviewer what your paper is going to be about and why it should be accepted. Again, make sure you've worked on grammar and the spelling. I recognize that for most of you, English is not your first language, but be very careful with English and get help. There's a lot of help out there now to help with English, but make sure you have done that legwork as well. And these are two comments, these are two suggestions I have that I put into my abstract. It's not required, but you want to state two primary purposes. One is, what is the new information? What is the paper going to be about? And you will see that in every one of my abstracts, you will see a sentence that says, this paper will discuss, or this paper will present. And I think it's important because if the reviewer is having a problem getting through, maybe you haven't written the greatest abstract, if you somewhere say this paper will, it focuses that reviewer back on, oh, okay, it's going to be about this, and that'll help you. The other thing is, I always tell them who's going to benefit by reading this paper, because in the end, they're trying to select papers or abstracts that will be papers that people want to come view in the session or download from OnePetro. So somewhere I also say this paper will benefit. And who will it be useful to? So this paper will benefit reservoir engineers who want to increase their confidence in reserve estimation. So these two things, I think, focus that reviewer on why they should accept the abstract. Again, this is my opinion. So let's talk about the pieces I just mentioned. First of all, let's talk about the title. A title is very important. I'm going to show you some examples of what the reviewer sees when they are evaluating paper or abstracts. But the very first thing we see is the title. So think of it as the first impression they have of your abstract. As I said before, if you're working on some key things that are going on today, so perhaps unconventional wells, a field or a basin, a case history, put that in your title. Say it's a case history. Say it's in a certain field. But put that, use buzzwords if you can. Keep in mind, the title is going to focus not just the reader, but the reviewer on what your paper is going to be about. So you want to hook them. You want them to read the title and think, oh, I really want to know more about what this abstract is going to be. And then, the last thing I just want to make sure you understand is you only get one chance to make that first impression. So once they've read the title, it's been read, and now they're on their own. So after we've worked on the title, the next thing we want to do is we want to work on the abstract itself. So SPE does something interesting, and that is when you submit the abstract portion, they have it divided up into 4 parts. And they divide it up into 4 parts so that it makes it actually easier for you to explain yourself and work in a nice, coherent manner. It also helps the reviewers because then it helps them organize. But the bottom line is you're going to see 4 parts, and each one has its own word count. The first part you're going to see is the objective and scope section. So what do you put in here? This is where you're going to put an introduction to the problem, an introduction to why you did the work you did, why you are writing the paper, why this is important work. What is the purpose for this project or what have you. So you're going to give introduction that it's in a certain field, and there's a certain problem they have in that field, and this paper is going to address that. It doesn't have to be long. The second part is one of the longer sections, and that's where you talk about kind of the methods or the procedures or what you did. So you're going to talk about the approach you took for the work, the project, the experimenting, the workflow. Basically think of it as, what did you do, or what did you find, and how did you find it, or how did you do the work? Okay, so it's introductory to the procedures and methods that you used. Again, you get more words to do that. The third section is really, I think, the most important section. This is probably what's going to get you over the finish line with getting accepted. And this is where you explain what you learned. Okay, you explain the results, maybe the conclusions, what were your observations? Why was this important? But this is where you're going to say, look, because of our work, we showed a 10% increase in recovery. So be very pointed there. And you remember before I said somewhere in my abstract, I make this comment about this paper will describe. This is the section where I normally put that. So in this section, I will say this paper will show how to improve your production by 15% in a shale well. So again, it focuses that evaluator. And then the last section is where you talk about novel and additive information. And this is the one that a lot of people struggle with because they may think, well, I didn't really do anything really new. I just applied some other principles to my problem. Well, it may not be novel or additive, but talk about who's going to benefit from this paper. And this is where I put my other comment. So this is where I will put the comment of this will help completions engineers who want to design more efficient frac designs will benefit from reading this paper. So again, it's a short section. So all you really need to do is explain what's new, what you're providing, and why it's important, who will benefit. So again, 4 sections. One thing I want to just say about this is if you write it well, each of these 4 sections will flow nicely from one to the next. So they won't repeat, they'll flow. And I'll show you an example of some abstracts in just a second. But one of the things you'll notice is that you can, if you do it well, you should be able to take all 4 of these sections. And when you actually write your paper, you should be able to copy them and drop them right into your paper's abstract and just expand on those sections because you won't have a word count limit. All right, so let me give you just a few tips that I have learned over the years as I've evaluated papers or abstracts, excuse me. These are some of the things that I think have helped some of the abstracts do better than others. So first of all, from a do's, so the things you should do to help improve your acceptance chance. First of all, like I said before, make sure you organize your thoughts. And by doing so, like I said before, that abstract should flow nicely. Use simple and direct sentences. Remember, not everyone who's reading the abstract may be as familiar with your project or with your field. And so be careful about using acronyms and abbreviations. Try to be very straightforward and common. Next, be sure you present technically sound story. Now, I'm not saying it has to be technically complicated, just sound. So make sure that it makes sense. This is where I would get some help from somebody to make sure that they think it's technically sound. Again, what you want to do is demonstrate to the reviewer why your paper and abstract will be relevant and useful to the conference. Now, if you work for a service company like I do or a supplier, one of the things that I think will help you get acceptance is if you can get an operator as a co-author. And what I mean by that is if I'm writing a paper from carboceramic standpoint, if I can get an operator like Hess or somebody to co-author with me, that will help the reviewers see that as a non-commercial paper. Otherwise, they're going to tend to think you could be writing a commercial and it'll be too commercial. So it adds a lot of credibility to get co-authors from various companies. The next thing I would do, as I mentioned before, is when you get done writing the abstract and you think you have a final draft, have a colleague review it who's never read it before. As we continue to reread things, we tend to miss things and we start to not see our mistakes. So have somebody read it who maybe doesn't have as much familiarity with your work and see what they think and see if they have questions and then modify it to help them. And then lastly, proofread it multiple times, have your colleague proofread it. One of the things I typically do, I find it helpful is, most of everything we're doing, of course, is on our computer, but when I've got a final copy, I'll print it out on a piece of paper and I'll just read it to myself and make sure it makes sense. And it's amazing how many mistakes and how many things you'll find just by printing it out and reading it in hard copy. That goes for not just the abstract, but when you write papers or technical papers, I suggest the same thing for that. In fact, it's probably even more important then to do that. So those are some of the do's. These are the things that I think help your chance of acceptance. So now I want to talk about some of what I call the don'ts. These are the things that will hurt your chance of acceptance. So the number one problem we have with rejecting papers is the commerciality side. And the reason that's important is because when we do feedback at our conferences and we ask people what the feedback on the technical program, typically the number one problem they have is that the presentations were too commercial. People don't want to hear a commercial. So make sure you don't have any company names or trade names or what have you inside your abstract. The other problem I tend to see sometimes is that people overwrite. They feel like they have to use all 350 or 400 words. Just write what you need and move on. Again, I don't want to keep harping on this, but grammar, broken sentences, good English, all these are important. And the reason they're important is because as I'm reading the abstracts to rate them, it's a very good indication of how well the paper is going to be written. So if you've written a poor abstract from a grammar standpoint, I believe the same thing is going to happen in your paper. So get help. And then the last thing, I know I've said this multiple times, is don't miss a deadline. Okay, put it in your calendar and make sure you don't miss it. So a couple other cautions before I show you some examples of some abstracts. The first thing is this first point on submitting the same abstract to multiple venues. There are people, and I've done this in the past, where you said, well, look, I've got the hydraulic fracturing conference and the annual technical conference. Their call for papers is at the same time, and I want to make sure I get it into one of them. So I'm going to submit it to both conferences. The problem with that is some people would submit to both, get accepted at both, and write two papers that were the same. So SPE many years ago implemented some restrictions. And so the bottom line is that you cannot submit the same abstract to two different venues at the same time. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do that after it's been, let's just say, rejected. You then want to submit it to something else. That's completely fine and encouraged. But just don't submit it to two different conferences at the same time, because what'll happen is they have software that'll find it, and then they'll just drop it out of both the conferences. So one conference at a time. But the other thing I want to make sure, another question a lot of people ask me is, well, what about if I'm submitting a different abstract for a different topic to the same event or the same conference? That is certainly allowed. There's no prohibition against doing that. I see that all the time. The one pointer, though, the one suggestion I would give you, though, is that if you do that, I would encourage you to get co-authors. And if you submit your name as the lead author on one abstract, I would get a co-author to put their name as the lead on another, because sometimes the program committee will look at multiple abstracts from the same person and say, well, we're only going to award them one, and we're going to try to spread around to others. Or they're just going to say, we're not sure they're going to have the time to write two good papers. So while it's completely legal and it's okay to submit different abstracts to the same event, I would probably change up the authors a little bit on that. And then the last one is about plagiarism. Plagiarism is not typically as big a deal in the abstract as it is in writing your paper itself, but just be careful of plagiarism. SPE actually has a plagiarism checker that they run on all the papers and the abstracts. If you'd like, you can access that. It'll be in your author kit, and SPE will give you one run through the plagiarism checker. The biggest problem with plagiarism is not normally plagiarizing other people. Usually it's you plagiarize yourself. You wrote a paper on a similar topic earlier, and now you kind of copy and paste some things. That's not allowed. So let me show you, I thought it would be helpful to show you what the reviewer, so if I'm the reviewer and I'm seeing now all the abstracts, this is an example of what I would see. Now, this is not a paper I wrote. I've even redacted the names of the company in the paper. And I'm not suggesting this is a good or bad abstract, but I just want to show you what people see. So the first thing, besides the control number, like I said before, the first thing I'm going to see is the title. Notice this title, they had refracturing horizontal wells, optimum conditions, and then a question. So really, what did they do? They hooked the reader on why they want to go ahead and read this further. Now this is for ATCE, so in this particular case, they had to designate the topic of that it's the category or the session it's going to go into. Not every conference will have this. However, they're also keywords. This will be something you'll see in the author in when you go online to submit, but you just have to give some keywords. These are the keywords of what, for search engines on what topics you're going to be covering. Then the next thing I see are the authors, and I'm going to see, the first thing I'm going to see is a corresponding author. So that's the person who's actually submitting the abstract, and they're the one that's in contact. And we typically think that's the lead author and their company affiliation. And then it lists all the co-authors and their company affiliations. So this is where I think it's important. If you have multiple abstracts, you have a different co-author as the first corresponding author. But this is also why it's important to have multiple company affiliations in there as well, because it shows more credibility to have that. The next thing is, remember I told you we have the 4 sections. And like I said before, these 4 sections kind of just show up in flow. So if it's a good abstract, you should be able to just flow from one thing to the next. Notice this is not my abstract, but I just want to point out a couple of things here. In the results and observations and conclusions, it says, this study looks at refrac and production data interpretations and shows the optimal completion refracs. So notice they followed what I said, and that is somewhere in there say what this is going to do. They also talked about the results that you're going to see. So again, this is a hook. In this case, they talked about the profitability. I would have probably added who it's going to benefit. Notice up here in the beginning, this is just some introductory discussion about shale oil and gas wells. Okay. So this is a good looking abstract. Again, they didn't use all 100 words down here in the novel, but they did what they needed to do to try to get it accepted. So the next one I want to show you, the next example is one of my abstracts. And frankly, this is the abstract of the paper that has been downloaded the most. Okay, that paper from 2007. Notice slickwater fracturing, food for thought. This was I think this is one of the reasons why it's been downloaded a lot, is because it mentioned slickwater fracturing. At the time, notice I also got a co-author from Denbury Resources, which is an operator. So like I said before, I try to have multiple companies represented on my abstracts. Here's then the rest of the abstract. The abstracts written back then were a little bit different. Even though there's the 4 sections, the word count was a little bit different, so that's why it's a little bit bigger. But it talks about the background, but I want to show you what do we see right here? 3rd paragraph, this paper will begin by reviewing the motivations. In addition, the authors will detail. In each case, emphasis will be placed on. Okay, so again, very clear on what this is going to be about. Then down here in the last paragraph, what does it say? This paper will serve as a resource to any engineer or technician who is designing pumping slickwater fracs or who is considering this technology. So again, it talked about the relevance and who's going to benefit from this paper. Is this why it was accepted? I don't know, but I think it's important that we do that as we write our abstracts. So those are just 2 examples. One is what we see as a reviewer, and the other is just an example of one I wrote. So let me talk a little bit about ORCID. I mentioned this before. So ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID. And beginning this coming year in January, all authors, whether they're co-authors or lead authors, have to have an ORCID ID in order to submit an abstract in a paper. And what is an ORCID ID? It's just a unique identifier that every author will have for the rest of their life. Okay, so it's in the United States, it would be like a social security number, an employee number. It's just basically, it's something that identifies you, so that it doesn't have to use names to try to figure out if an author is common. So it's important because what this does is it allows publications, not just One Petro and SPE, but other publications who cross-reference our database to link up an author and all the papers and all the technical reports they've ever written. So your unique ID doesn't have to, some names, of course, people have very common names to other people. So it's a unique number identifier. It's free. So all you have to do is go to this website here. You could just Google this and find it. It's a free thing. And once you've registered it once, you'll have an ORCID ID. And then that's just the ID that you put on your abstracts and your paper manuscripts whenever you submit them. So very simple. You just something you just need to make sure you do before you submit the abstract. All right, just a few more things I want to talk about here because I think they're helpful when it comes to the abstract. But let me just talk a little bit about the submission process itself. So as you can imagine, everything we do is submitted online. I showed you the link before. It's at the call for papers. When you follow that link, it'll take you to a separate page where you have to log in. You do have to have an SPE ID. One of you at least has to have an SPE ID to submit. Not all your co-authors have to have SPE. And you'll just follow the instructions. I suggest you go on there sooner rather than later. That way you can begin the process and pause, and that allows you to see the things you're going to need. I mean, you're going to need to have everyone's names, their full names. You'll need to have their ORCID IDs like we just talked about. You need to have the address and contact information of all your co-authors. The good news is if your co-authors are SPE members and you know their SPE member, it'll self-populate it. It'll find the member and put it in there for you. But the bottom line is you'll need to know that information. Of course, if you wait to the last minute, you're going to have a hard time finding your authors and stuff. So just as ever in everything else, just don't wait to the last minute. Particularly, don't wait for the last minute to log into the system for the first time, because you don't want to find out that you don't remember your password or your login ID at the at 11 o'clock. An hour to go from in the upload. So do it early, understand what you're going to get into, and then upload it. I would also try to do it a day before, if nothing else, because the system can get pretty slow on the day of the deadline. So I want to talk a little bit about the process and what's going to happen. So you are going to submit your abstract, and it's going to go to the program committee that we talked about before. That program committee acts as a selection committee. And what they're going to do is they have an online system whereby they can read and review all the abstracts, and they're going to rate them. Okay, they're going to give them a rating anywhere from 1 to 6, and it can be halves. So 4.5, 5, 3.5, and so on. So all of the program committee members rate them. Typically, a program committee is made up of somewhere around 15 people, 10 to 20. We want to have a large number of them so that one person's rating doesn't control everything. But after everyone does their ratings, the system will then give the selection committee or the program committee the ranking from highest rated to lowest rated. And the ratings are asked to be objective and impartial. So people, in fact, if you have a paper in there or abstract, you're supposed to not rate yourself. If you have a colleague, you shouldn't rate their papers as well. So we try to do a very good job of being impartial. But then once that ranking has occurred, we know how many technical sessions there are. We know how many papers are in each session. So let's say there's 4 sessions of 8 papers, so that's 32 papers. So we know the top 32 will be selected for the papers of presentation. We also may choose to have some alternate papers. And we have alternates usually it's 2 to 4 alternate papers for each session. So that would be 4 sessions. So maybe 16 more, 15, 16 more. A lot of times we'll look down the list of the next grouping of papers and ranking and see if there's some that should be pulled up because they really fit the topic and they were highly rated. So those we may have more or less alternates for that reason. So what's going to happen is once that's done, there are really 1 of 3 responses you're going to get from SPE. The first one will be potential is the one that you want, and that is accepted for paper and for presentation. Please confirm that you're going to write the paper and meet the deadline. That's the one obviously that would put you into the full paper session. It's also possible that your abstract does not get accepted. If it doesn't get accepted, I want to make sure everybody understands that there's a lot of really good abstracts that don't get accepted sometimes just because there's so many abstracts submitted and we only have so many slots. Like I said before, ATCE runs 15 to 20% in their selection. So, a 1 in 8, 1 in 10 chance of being selected. If you're not accepted, I would suggest, and you still want to write the paper, I would suggest a couple of things. One is look for another venue, look for a smaller venue, a regional venue, but also have somebody read it who hadn't read it before and ask them, what do you think? Why do you think this wasn't accepted? If you can find somebody on the program committee, you might ask them. But at any rate, get that found out. And if you want to, then you can resubmit to another venue. The third thing you might be told, though, is that your abstract was accepted for a paper, which is good news, and it's going to be an alternate. As I said before, alternates are important. If it is an alternate, it typically means it's an e-poster. Let me talk about this response here just for a moment. I want to make sure everybody understands there are a lot of people who say, I don't want to be an alternate. It's not a real paper. I don't want to put my time in for that. My suggestion is write the paper. So whether you're an alternate or you're a full paper presentation, you write the same paper. The paper still goes into one Petro, and it looks like any other paper from the conference. It doesn't say that it was an alternate. So it will go into the system. It can be downloaded. It can even be sent to peer review and put into a journal. So you get all the rights and privileges of any other paper that was written. The other thing, though, is it's very possible as an alternate, you may get pulled to the main program. People have travel restrictions. People have problems getting there. Sometimes they don't get approval. And sometimes those papers are pulled at the last minute. I've even had some people who weren't able to get their visa in time, and so they couldn't get there to present. And on the day of the meeting, an alternate gets moved up in as a main presentation. The other thing is it does become an e-poster regardless. And e-posters, if you've never seen an e-poster, there usually is a kiosk, a set of computers set up in a central area where people give their e-posters. Those are all the alternates. An e-poster is about a 15-minute presentation. And it's really cool because there's usually about 10 to 15 people there. And everybody who comes to an e-poster really wants to hear and see. And it's a really interactive session. I get as much out of e-posters as I get out of anything else. So my point here is, if you're selected as a regular paper or even as an alternate or e-poster, please write the paper because I think you'll find it's very beneficial to you. All right, so let me just summarize here and then we'll open up the floor to hopefully a lot of good questions. As I mentioned before, I think we have to remember that there are many forms of technical writing. Not just technical papers like we've talked about here today, but even things as mundane as email can be considered technical writing. And as you do those writings, you should be very careful with what you're writing and proofread and be careful. As we mentioned, there's just really a lot of good reasons to write an SPE paper. The most important reason is because it helps you, it helps your reputation, it helps get your name out, and of course it helps your employers and your colleagues as well. I can't impress upon you enough the importance of the abstract. The abstract is what dictates whether you're going to be accepted to be writing the full paper. The good news is we don't have to write full papers to get them accepted. We get to write abstracts, but they have to be good. They have to have a good title. They need to be clear and concise, error-free. You really should think about co-authors if you can. And again, case histories, case studies, things that are important for today's technology are usually highly accepted. And again, the last two things I want to leave you with is please proofread them. Please read them twice, get help, and don't forget the deadlines. You have to meet the deadlines for the abstract. And the question I'll leave you with at this point in time is what are you going to write? So with that, I'll open it up to questions. I don't know how you want to do this, verbal or via the chat.
Dear attendants of today's session, feel free to ask any questions in the chat below or by using hand raise so I can give you the permission to open the microphone. If any questions arise, I will just notify you, Mr. Terry.
Okay. And I'll be happy to go back to a slide if somebody needs me to go back to a slide or something, or what have you.
Roger that. Okay.
I see someone with a hand up.
Dear Al Qasim, you can turn on your microphone.
Yes, thank you. Hello, yes,
Yeah, but your audio, your voice is not quite clear. Please check it out.
What about now?
Very good.
Yeah, clear.
Hello, Doctor. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this very great session. Honestly, it was so comfortable to hear all of these topics. Forgive me for my English. I'm not used to speak English. Speak in English so much. Doctor, I have a question about the fees of travel. If I give a paper and it was accepted, do I need to pay the fees of travel myself, or the conference will take care of it for me?
Yeah. So thanks for the question. And your English is just fine. I understood it. So as far as the fees for the conference, there are multiple fees. So of course, there's the registration for the conference. And then of course, there's the travel to and from and the stay. SPE does not typically, or the conference does not typically reimburse you for any travel arrangements. I think every once in a while they may help with a keynote speaker or something like that, but that's not at all normal. Normally you have to get yourself there. The registration fees, sometimes those though are discounted. So if you're an author, you might get a discounted rate for your registration over what a normal delegate would be. So there is typically, or there can be a reduction for your fee for your registration. But unfortunately, we don't typically reimburse. SP doesn't reimburse for any travel fees, which is again an important part of selecting the right venue for you, if it's something that you think you can travel to.
Dear Al Qasim, any more questions?
I will say, hopefully, if you work for a company may reimburse you or cover your travel fees. So that would be a good thing to ask your company as well. So sorry.
Another question from Lee. What is the time interval between abstract acceptance and final paper submission?
That's a very good question. So it's depends on the conference, but I'll give you an example. So ATCE, so SPE ATCE, the conference itself is in October. The abstracts are due in January. So about 10 months before the abstracts are due, before the conference. The authors will be notified roughly April 1st. So about a month or two later, they'll be notified of whether they're accepted. And then you typically have until the middle to end of somewhere in July to write the manuscript. So that would be May, June, July. So about 2 to 3 months to write. And then another month or so to put your PowerPoint together and things like that. I would say that's the longest you have. I mean, ATCE is probably the longest one. Some of them are a little bit quicker. You don't have quite as much time, but typically you have a month or two to write your paper from the moment that you've been given acceptance.
I assume no more questions are there. So thank you, Mr. Terry, and such a useful lecture of today. And we shall see you in some future sessions, I
You do
suppose.
have, I do see a hand there, Dr.
Okay.
Alkalai.
Okay. So I suppose there is Dr. Layal. She's our supervisor. Dr. Layal, feel free
Hi,
to
Mr.
turn on your
Terry.
microphone.
Bayachi, I think your name.
Yep, we can
I
hear you.
hope
We can hear you.
it's okay. Thank you. Hi, Mr. Terry, sorry.
No problem.
I am faculty advisor of the students chapter to Basra University for Oil and Gas. I want to thank you to be here today with us. Thank you, and I convey to you the grace of presence of our university. Thank you to accepting our invitation. That will be honor for us. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And again, the honor is all mine.
Thank you. Thank you.
So one thing before we go, would it be helpful if I can give you this presentation PDF and you could post it on your site, or if you'd like that, just tell me and I can send it to you.
We'd be glad to receive the presentation.
Fair enough. I will do that.
Thank you, Mr. Terry, and very glad stay with us, and we shall see you some future sessions, I assume. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Terry.
Bye.
Dear attendances, workers, engineers, students from all over the industry with us here in this session, I'd like to announce that you have to fill the attendance sheets right below in the chat. You can find the attendance registration form, so you can fill it, and your name will be registered as one of the attendants. And thank you. سادة الحضور، يرجى ملء استمارة الحضور اللي موجودة أسفل بالشات. شكرا لكم على حضوركم، ونتمنى لكم ليلة سعيدة. شكرا لكم.